Thanks. All right. Oh, sorry for the false alarm earlier. I think we're ready to go, and I think Dan will count me in for starting the live stream. All right, welcome back to Mountain Minds Monday. Before we get started with our main presentation, I will go over our sponsors for tonight's event. So our gold sponsor is Holland & Hart. You all met Dick, who's here from Holland & Hart. And so Holland & Hart, they have offices throughout the West, including Reno and Carson City. They practice many types of law, including intellectual property, which might be of interest here. Our silver sponsors, so we've got Heads Up Health. So we have Dave here from Heads Up Health, and he'll tell you a little bit.
Hi all, my name is Dave Korsunski. My company's Heads Up Health. We sponsor the low-carb food. And we make a software program to help you carefully track your health metrics. We're Truckee-based, and I've got a station set up at the back that has some of the latest technology for tracking health. If you want to stop by and learn more about it, after the session's over, we'll be in the back room. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. People had a bunch of fun at his booth last time, so definitely encourage you to go over there after it. So also at the silver level, Mobile Law, and we also have Troy here. So Mobile Law, they have offices in Truckee, Reno, Sacramento, and Incline Village, and they represent clients in business law, construction law, estate planning, family law, intellectual property, real estate law, and bankruptcy. And our other silver sponsor is Mountain Workspace, and they're a newly opened co-working space. Well, I guess not that new anymore, since this March, and they're in Incline Village. And so definitely go check that out if you haven't. And then we have our community partners, the Truckee Chamber of Commerce and Truckee Tahoe Community Television here, the Lyft Co-working, and of course our venue here, Pizza on the Hill. So the big question is, how do you become a sponsor? So we've got a ton of information at the link shown. We also have the information up at registration as well. You can always send an email or just go ahead and ask me. We'd love for your business to become a sponsor. And that's how we run all these events, especially at the pay what you can model. And then also I want to thank all of our individual sponsors. And so if you haven't heard about our individual sponsorship program, for $150 for the whole year, it gets you entrance to our Mountain Mind Monday events. So that's 12 per year. You get your pizza and salad and low-carb food when it's available at all the events. And then you get 1 beer or wine, or if you don't want alcohol, you can have 2 sodas. And then we generally have a separate check-in line if you're an individual sponsor, so you can get checked in really fast. So all the information is at that link, or you can pay at any registration that you'd like. So thank you to all our existing individual sponsors here. We really appreciate it. And so now time for the main event. So I want to introduce to you Mary Gorden, and I have a bio for her. So Mary L. Gorden is a strong advocate for women in STEM. Her 35-year career in computers has given her an insider's view of the history of computing and the role that women played in that history. Her memoir, Life Without Ceilings, A Woman's Career in Computers, shares her experience as computers changed from punch card devices to the gateway to the internet. She recounts how the number of women in computing grew over the course of her career and how their influence increased. We are so happy to have Mary here tonight, and I will let her take the stage.
Let's see, am I turned on? Okay. Okay, can you hear me?
You stand right in front of that fire extinguisher.
I need to stand back here.
Okay.
All right.
And you've got that okay?
We're good.
All
right. Clicker. Okay, good evening. My name is Mary Gorden, as Rachel said, and I'm here to talk to you about a history of computing through the eyes of one woman's career. Now, as you might expect, the career that I'm going to use to focus is mine. I became a programmer back in 1966. I retired as a chief system architect in 2001. In between that, I spent some time designing online real-time systems and managing the development of both large projects and small projects. There are two things I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk about how the computer became a business tool, and I'm going to talk about the role of women in computers. So if we look at the period 1966 to 2001, it's often an overlooked period of history, which is really a shame because that was when it became a business tool. But there's been a lot of focus back on computing in the 40s and 50s. Has anyone seen the movie Hidden Figures, or better yet, read the book? Yeah, I mean, that's the current period that's getting a lot of focus. There's also another book called The Rise of the Rocket Girls, which talks about a similar group of women at JPL out here in California. So that's worth doing. There's also a lot of being written about the 80s and 90s when personal computers came out and when the internet came out. But the 60s and 70s are pretty much an overlooked period. And it's a shame because that was when there was a great increase in the number of women in the computing industry. There's this myth that's floating around that talks about the fact that programming used to be a woman's job, that back in the 40s, all programmers were women, and there's been this really steady decline ever since. It's really not true. Yes, there were a lot of women programmers back in the 40s. There were a lot of women doing a lot of non-woman type jobs because all the men were off fighting the Second World War. When the war was over, many of those jobs reverted to being men's jobs. When I became a programmer in 1966, we were looking at about 15% of the people in computing were women, and that continued to grow until about 1991. I'd like to start with taking a closer look at 1966. There's really two salient facts about 1966 that I'd like to share with you. First of all, nobody knew very much about computers. They were very big machines with limited functionality. I think the first computer I worked on as a professional had 64K, not megs, K of memory. They lived in their own air-conditioned rooms, had limited functionality, and since most of the work that was being done with computers was being done by either the military or the science department, didn't touch anybody's lives. And the other thing that everybody knew, to offset not knowing anything about computers, was that everybody knew that women didn't have careers, especially they didn't have careers in technology. It's really hard today to look back 50 years ago and realize how deeply ingrained in our society the idea was that women's jobs were to be wives and mothers, and that was it. Even when you went to look for a job, jobs were segregated by gender. There used to be two categories: help-wanted men, help-wanted women. I'm not quite sure when that stopped. I'm guessing the late 70s. I do know that I looked for my first 3 jobs in the help-wanted men category because that's where they were. Okay. I remember one hiring manager saying to me, "We usually don't hire girls. They just get pregnant and leave." And needless to say, I didn't go to work for that company. But given the environment, you might be wondering how I managed to find my way to be a computer programmer. And I was just always interested in math and science. And many young girls are, and we tend to sort of beat it out of them. I was fortunate to have a grandfather who was very interested in future things, And my first stated ambition was to become an astronomer and go to the moon. And I completely blame him for the fact that I had that ambition. My father was a very traditional sort of a person, but he loved to talk about math and science. And so he would talk about math and science with me. And I said to him, well, you know, you don't think I should get a job? Why are you bothering to teach me all these things? And he said, so you can teach your children. And I think in many ways that sort of describes the environment in which I grew up. Moving ahead, there's a couple of things that pop up when I think of the computer in 1966. The first one is paper. The picture on the right, excuse me, I guess it's on the left, it's a picture of me in 1966. I am showing off my program, which existed on punched cards, and I'm showing it to my father and my brother. Punch cards were heavy cardboard cards. They were, I mean, they weren't very thick. They were 3 1/4 by 7 3/8. They were 80 columns wide and 12 rows high. And they were created using a machine called a key punch machine, which had a QWERTY keyboard, just like a typewriter or anything. But instead of putting a character onto a piece of paper or later on electrons into a computer, it actually punched the computer configuration for each character that you wanted. So there was a different one for the letter 1, the number 1, the capital A, small a, special characters. And that's what the key punch machine did. The second picture over here, you may have actually seen this. The woman in this picture is Margaret Hamilton, who was the lead programmer on the computer work that was done for Apollo 11, our first trip to the moon. And usually when you see this picture, she's standing next, it's a full body shot, and that's the programs and the data that went into the support of Apollo 11. And the reason there's so much paper is because you couldn't look at anything in a computer. The only way you could see your program, the only way you could see the data was by printing it out. So the second thing that was interesting about 1966 is COBOL, which was a computer language. It was one of the early machine-independent languages. On early computers, basically people wrote code that the computers could understand directly. And so it was sort of a very limited set of instructions. For example, most of them were sort of restricted to add A and B. When we got into this advanced language called COBOL, we were able to write as a single sentence, add A to B giving C. So it added a lot more flexibility to what you could do. It was designed very much for business applications. And it was designed to read like English. For those of you who have been programmers and know that you have to document your code or you won't be able to understand it, the same thing was true with COBOL programs. You had to put comments in there so that you could even understand your code, much less someone else's. The woman up there is Grace Hopper. She did the initial design work on which the programming language COBOL was used, and several of the programmers that actually wrote the compiler to make COBOL a working language were also women. So again, this is 50s, 60s time frame. We've got some other examples of machine-independent programming languages. Fortran was another early programming language. It was designed to be for the scientists. It was really easy to do complicated mathematical formulas in Fortran. And a lot of programs in the early days were producing reports. IBM eventually came out with a program called RPG, which stood for Report Program Generator, and that became the standard. But writing the programs to do reports was actually fairly difficult because there were no functions that you could borrow. So for every program you wrote, if you wanted to do page breaks, You had to count the number of lines. When you got to the number of lines that would fit on a page, you had to eject to the next page and print new headings. So programs like RPG sort of eliminated that problem. The first job that I worked at, I actually worked as part of a team where we wrote our own version of RPG. There were a lot of people who were writing tools for programmers in those days. Okay. Then we moved into terminals and databases. This is 1970s now, and the first terminals were what we called line-at-a-time terminals. You couldn't use the whole screen, much less have multiple pages up on a screen. There was basically a line that you could either print out or type information in, and it would just scroll. So you couldn't enter any significant amount of data. It was just sort of a fixed format on that one line. I got involved in it because, as I said, businesses were starting to use computers, and Fortune 200 companies were automating their order entry process. So instead of somebody calling up and somebody writing down the order and then having data entered into the computer, you could actually sit at a screen, fill in the various fields on the screen, and then in real time have it uploaded. You could also check inventory. And the company that I worked for was in the business of building real-time online systems for Fortune 200 companies. So that's how I got involved with terminals. And there was sort of a side benefit of the fact that we were doing these systems development work is that by this time terminals had replaced the key punch machines, but they were this line at a time thing. The programmers needed terminals in order to test the programs. So they got these spiffy new terminals in their computer that they could actually use to write their programs on. And for those of us who were doing the design work, we went from typewriters to word processing pools. And on my second design project, I got a word processing terminal in my office, and it speeded up the whole process quite a bit. The downside or upside, depending on how you look at it, is that since we'd moved away from the amount of data you could put on a punch card or the amount of data you could put on a line on a screen to multiple fields on a screen, the complexity of data that was being captured increased dramatically. And so add-ons to languages were developed so that you could create databases. And within fairly short order, there wasn't just one database language, there was multiple database languages. The number of women in computing had been increasing fairly rapidly, and by this time I was sort of getting promoted. At first I was hiring programmers, and then I was hiring technical leads, and then I was hiring project managers, and we were finding women that could do all these jobs. So it was still remained very much of a male-dominated field, but we were getting more and more women in there all the time. I could frequently go to meetings and not be the only woman in the room. In the 1980s, businesses started distributing their computing power to offices. And as a result, you'd have a central computer, and you'd have a lot of different offices around that weren't close. And so companies developed their own private networks to connect the central computer to the terminals in the field. I sort of view this period as when we had what's the precursor of the cloud. The first time somebody told me about the cloud, you don't store your data on your local computer, you store your data at a central computer someplace. It's like, I've been there, I remember that. So I think the cloud is probably a little bit safer than networks were in those days. They crashed a lot. there were a lot of things to crash. The computer itself could crash, the network could be down, there could be some local problem. And so I was working for a brokerage firm at the time, and we had, all of our processing was done centrally, and there were 100 offices around the country. And so someone came up with this idea of using this brand new machine called the IBM PC as a backup device. So when the network was down, you couldn't access the central computer, you could still put the information into the PC, and then when the network came back up, you could upload all of the data. And so it made the branch people very happy that they didn't have to do data entry after the fact when they had plenty of other things to do. The one thing that was really kind of interesting, at that point by this time I was a manager, so I wasn't really working on the code, but we had to put computers in 100 different places. And right now, there's sort of a standardized way to do installs. Everybody, is used to seeing the same basic set of steps when you install a new program on your PC. Again, we were inventing this. We had to come up with our own way of doing it. And we must have been successful because we managed to not send anybody from headquarters out to the field. Everybody got their machines up and running. Okay. Private networks were starting to be invaded by dial-up capability. You could actually dial in. By this time I was working for a credit card company, and it really made credit cards much more useful because it was hard to hook up every merchant in the country to your central computer, but they could all have a dial-up terminal and access your things. So the role of women was also changing during this time frame. I was having women peers. I had my first woman boss in 1990. I remember, though, one conversation, there were 4 women managers standing around and we were talking, and one of the women said, "Look at the 4 of us. And we think that women have made such great progress." And another woman said, "Well, we have made great progress." And the first woman said, "Yes, but I'm the only one that has a child." And so it was a price that a lot of professional women paid back in those days, and perhaps are still paying to some extent, of deciding not to have children in order to have a career. And I knew many women who married late. They were doing their first marriages in their late 30s and early 40s. Okay. The final area that I worked on really is sort of outside of this, the mainstream a little bit, but it has its own particular story. It was chip cards. And you may think chip cards are new because your credit cards have just suddenly appeared with chips on them. Well, actually, we were working on these things back in the mid-1990s. The telecommunications system in the US was so good that the banks didn't want to spend the extra money to go to chips. And so most of the work we were doing was with the Europeans and with the Asians because they had pretty awful telecommunication systems and fraud was a real problem. The piece that I got interested in or involved in was something called personalization. I don't know if you've ever looked at your credit card particularly closely, but it has a unique number on it. It has your name on it, has an expiration date, and on the back of it, it has a magnetic stripe with the same information on it. The process of putting that on the cards had been around for years, and there were companies that personalized credit cards. All of a sudden, we added this chip. And it was just like going from punch cards to databases. The complexity of the data that you had to deal with, the changes to the systems that process the personalization of the cards had to change. You had to invent new things. So it was kind of like my whole career had sort of prepared me to work on this thing because I'd already been through those things once before. And now with going back to a little tiny chip, I mean, we were talking about chips that had like 4K of memory on them. The same problems that we'd solved, 20 years earlier or 30 years earlier were back being resolved with brand new technology. And I suspect that that's a recurring theme in computers now and will continue to be in the future. The last thing that I did was I actually worked on an international group that was designing standards for a chip application called electronic purse. It's like anonymous cash. Just like a $20 bill, you could have one of these chip cards that had $20 on it, and it wasn't tied to any of your accounts. And there were a lot of companies around the world that were working on this, and so I was part of a group that did standards. And again, talking about the progress that women had made, all of us on the technical team had pretty decent technical credentials, but we had two superstars. One of them was the other American on the team, who happened to be a man, and then we had a German woman. And I tell you, we just all sort of stood back in awe and looked at the kind of technical stuff they were doing. And it was really good because the Americans and the Germans on the business team had very different ideas as to what we needed to do with these standards. And the fact that we had the techies from the two countries that were fighting business-wise who could figure out how to give them what they wanted, technically, was really, really a plus. Anyway, this was the last project that I worked on. I was offered a chance to work on an internet project, but I stayed with the chip cards. I think it's interesting to sort of compare 1966 with today, going back to my initial slide. No one knew much about computers, and everyone knew that women didn't have careers in technology and computers. Today, it's impossible to function without having an access to a computer. And I really hate to put this up there, but I think it's still true. Some people still don't think that women belong in technology. I'm always sort of stunned by when I hear this, because it's, as I've given you through the examples, there have always been women in computers. They've always done well. I've known some brilliant male technicians, some brilliant women technicians, lots and lots of good, solid programming people of both genders. Actually, late in my career, I actually finally met a woman who I thought, what in the world are you doing in computers? Which I felt was good because the barriers were coming down. I'd met men that I thought that of before. Okay. The other sort of disappointing thing about today's world is that, let's see, hang on. Well, there we go, okay. This chart starts in 1985, and actually the upward swing went for about 20 years before then. So there was this long, steady climb of percentage of women in computing. And it ended in about 1991, and since then it's been falling. And actually, I'm sort of an optimist by nature. I see some good stuff in this. When I got into computers, there were no barriers to entry. You didn't even need a college degree. You certainly didn't need an engineering license or any kind of certification. Well, one of the things that's happened to computers over my career is that you need a college education. A degree in computer science is even better. There are lots of certifications that you probably should get if you want to be hired. And I think the reason that the percentage of women is going down is maybe because there's a whole bunch of other fields that it's just as easy to get into, and maybe they'd rather be an engineer, maybe they'd rather be an astrophysicist. So the other question that this chart raises in my mind is, how are we really defining women in computers? I went to a WordPress conference. I did my first one a couple years ago, And I was expecting to stand out like a sore thumb. I was expecting that everybody at the conference would be male and millennial. And they weren't. I mean, there was a lot of gender diversity, not as much ethnic diversity as I would have liked to have seen. Ages ranged all over the place, and this was not only attendees but speakers. And so when people say that only 15% of the computer jobs are held by women, it's like, well, how do you define it? Does the person who basically helps me build my website, who happens to be a woman, is she counted as a woman in computing or not? I mean, so I prefer to look at the positive sides of that screen. And then, in case I haven't said this often enough, I'd like to say it just one more time. There is just no correlation between whether you're suited to do the job you want to do and what your gender is. It's almost all social bias, and someday we will get rid of that. The reason I use the word almost is I think there are probably a few examples, like it's probably better if you want to be an NFL linebacker to be a man. On the other hand, there was a discovery of a bunch of humanoid bones buried deep in caves in South Africa a few years ago. And the whole archaeological team that went down into the caves to retrieve the bones were all women, because the passageways down to the caves were so small that they looked for small people who could deal with caves, who had background in archaeology. So there are still some things where gender perhaps does make a difference. For those of you who are interested, I've got some reading material here. There's a couple of really good history books that cover the time frame that I've talked about. Recoding Gender is one, and it focuses on the history of women in computers. It doesn't talk so much about business. It talks about in the years 60s and 70s, it talks more about women in academia than business, but it's still a good overview of the history of computers. The Computer Boys Take Over is another one. The author, to give him credit, admits that a lot of the computer boys were actually female. And again, it's a good, serious historical work done on the period. I've mentioned Rise of the Rocket Girls and Hidden Figures, which if you haven't read them, they're really quite readable. There's also several memoirs out on this period. There's mine, which of course I would encourage everyone to read, called Life Without Ceilings, which talks about much more than I've managed to touch on tonight, but you've got the basic framework of about what I talk about. Atypical Girl Geek, written by Catherine Hitchcock. Interestingly enough, her career began in 1966, and she retired in 2001, same time frame as I did. She spent her whole career working for IBM, so it's a slightly different perspective on what was going on. And then the third one that I recommend is Letting IT Go. It's by Dame Stephanie Shirley, and as you can probably tell by the title, she's British. She formed a women-only programming firm back in the 1960s. I mean, so her view of what was going on and how difficult it was for women to get into the field is really pretty interesting. So anyway, there's our three memoirs that you might want to consider. And
I was just going to make a quick comment. The list of books is posted in the Facebook event, so you can, if you want to refer back to it, you can find it there.
Okay. And does anybody have any questions?
I'm the mic runner, but I have the mic. mic so I can also start with a question. So looking at the 25%, I think there could be different answers. So what are we going to do about this? One is like that you hinted at, well, barriers have been come down. Maybe women just choose to do something with less barriers to entry. One could say maybe we should put a lot of emphasis in having special programs, training, and motivating girls. I tried that with my daughters. So far, not so much success yet. And the other perspective would be, let's put in quotas in certain jobs and companies. So what is your take on those three?
Well, I don't want to imply that I think that everybody ought to go into computers. As a matter of fact, I'm quite the opposite. There are a lot of people who I think belong nowhere near a computer. The only point that I'm making is that just because you were born a girl as opposed to being born a boy doesn't mean you can't have a successful career. There are a lot of people that are out working on getting young girls exposed to computers early on in grade school. There are a lot of computer hacking camps that are inexpensive, that are designed just for girls and young women. I think the biggest problem still remains that there still is a cultural bias against women in technical fields, and you have to be pushy to get noticed. I don't know any other way to say it. And what we need to do is we need to encourage a lot more men to pay attention to the women they're working with, to encourage their girl children to follow these careers. So we still have work to do, but we've come a long way in the last 50 years. Okay.
So your focus there seemed to be on working with women in a workforce. Does it start there? I mean, as a 33 years of software engineering, there weren't a lot of women applying for the jobs either. So there's got to be some component of this that trickles back down into education, or
yes,
making them available for the job.
Yes. I mean, it's both. It's retention once women get into computing, which is still a problem, and getting young girls interested in the technical fields. Like I said, I was really interested in math and science when I was a kid. I couldn't imagine not doing something related to that. I talked to my friend. I have a lot of friends my age, many of whom became teachers and nurses. And they said, how come you were so persistent? I was told girls didn't do these things, so I didn't do them. And so I think that, and this is the appeal to fathers, is convince, if your girl child expresses interest in math and science, encourage them, because they can be just as good at it as the boys. Okay.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how you started, like how you came into the field.
Well, actually, it was sort of a silly way. I didn't know very much about computers when I was in college. I was actually in a pre-med program. That was when I started college, I was going to be a doctor. And then I discovered I hated chemistry, and so decided perhaps pre-med was not the field I should be in. I was dating a fellow who could be found hanging out in the computer lab. I mean, even in those days, boys knew computers, girls didn't. And so I went and I key punched his programs for him, good girlfriend. And then I realized how fascinating this field was. And the idea of becoming a math teacher had no appeal. So I went looking for a job as a programmer. And it was just as businesses were starting to really gear up for the computer world. And so there weren't enough people to fill all the jobs, and so they were willing to take a chance on women. I knew I had taken both of the classes that the college offered, only one of which was for credit. The one that wasn't for credit was Fortran, and the one that was for credit was coding in the machine level language. So I already had that as a background. They handed me a book that says, read this and learn COBOL, and gave me a program to write. So that was kind of how I got into it. There were about 40 people in that department. There were 6 or 7 of us who were women. All but one was a fresh college graduate. One of the big regrets in my life is that the 35-year-old woman who was a programmer when I first got my first job, I never asked her how she got into the business. I think that would have been fascinating. But, you know, I was 20, 22, what did I know?
Question, kind of a different tack. So you've seen the technology grow from, say, machine language into the more abstract languages, and the computing power increase. And I wonder if you saw changes, excuse me, in the interactions with the people in the workplace, and maybe particularly between men and women. Do you think the technology impacted the interactions? Did things change as you were in the business, or do you think people were people pretty consistently throughout?
People were people pretty consistently throughout. The best places to work were the departments where people talked to each other, shared information, were willing to teach you things, and that didn't change from the day I walked in the door as a beginning programmer till the day I walked out the door. I was still learning things from other people, and that's what really makes these things work, because nobody has all the answers, and a lot of times I was fortunate enough to be sort of at the intersection of business and technology, and so that's a real tricky thing, because you've got to learn to speak 2 languages. Because true techies don't talk to true business people. I mean, they just don't. And I mean, I was one of those techies who didn't understand what business people were saying. But you really need people who are willing to stand at that intersection, because it doesn't make any difference how spiffy the technology is if it doesn't do what the business wants. It's not particularly useful. No. Okay.
Yeah, I was interested on this feeling of familiarity of the different cycles. When you said the cloud, I've been there. And I was wondering, since you've been pretty much from the beginning, how do you feel about the artificial intelligence breakthrough, and whether that is another one of these familiarity points, or we are at the end of a discipline, in this sense? Well,
I'm a science fiction writer. I've always known about artificial intelligence. So I don't know how it fits in as a technology. One of the articles I read somewhat recently was by someone who was talking about the future of programming, and his contention was that you wouldn't write code anymore. You wouldn't actually ever write anything. You would talk to artificial intelligence that did all of the work. And for me, when I started, when you wrote code, you were touching the machine. What people are writing now as code is a long way from what the machine does. So the next step, to have this artificial intelligence where you tell it what you want to do and it figures out what the code needs to be, that makes perfect sense to me. Okay.
I have a question. You had a slide there where you showed the spike of women in computer technology in the 80s. Yeah, that one. And then it going down. And I just wanted to understand, I have 2 questions. One is, were you implying that the reason was because education got more formalized and it was more informal before? And I wanted to understand why that would be a barrier. And then second follow-up question is, do you think it will change now that there is a higher demand of the computing workforce and lesser talent out there because companies are more willing now to take people with lesser formal education?
Yeah. I didn't think that the formalization of the computer field, well, it was a barrier. When I got into it, there were no barriers. It was just really easy if you were a person interested in doing logical thinking to get a job as a computer programmer. It was just really easy. It's not quite as easy today because most people, you need to demonstrate that you can code, you need a college education, you probably need some sort of certificates. And so if I was in my 20s now or in college now, would I become a computer programmer? I don't know. I might have gone back to my original dream of wanting to be an astronomer and going to the moon. Sally Ride is only 7 years younger than me, America's first woman in space. I mean, I was just sort of right on the edge of when opportunities started to come. And so what I'm thinking with that decline is that more and more women are going into more different technical fields because it's just as hard to become a computer programmer as it is to become an engineer. And maybe they think engineering is more fun. Did that answer your question? You had a follow-up.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you see that changing. Because there's more, like he was talking about artificial intelligence, and there's more technology being utilized with the speed of lightning where there is no education available now and people are learning on the fly and learning on the job and the demands are higher. So do you think that'll change? There's definitely not enough people available to do all the programming jobs that need to be done. So the problem is that companies are still thinking that you need somebody with 5 years of experience in this list of certificates and a computer science degree. So it's a cultural bias that has to change, but it changed once, so maybe it can change again.
Next question. I remember I was working at Sun Microsystems when Java first came out and seeing ads for Java programmers with at least 5 years experience, and nobody had any more than maybe 3 or 6 months worth of experience. Also, referring to your curve of the number of women in computing over time, I graduated from college around the beginning of that curve, and I remember in the early 90s wondering, where have all the women gone? Because I had in my class a group of friends that I hung out with, about a third of them were women, and I remember just being puzzled about why it seemed like there were fewer each year.
That certainly seems to be the case. Yeah, and I have, at the time that was happening to you, I was totally unaware that it was happening because I was still working with a lot of different women in the 90s. And if you'd showed me that graph, I would say, I don't think so. I don't see any signs of that. But I wasn't dealing with the junior programmers at the time. So I think there's been, over the last several years, there's been a lot of organizations come up who are really out to encourage young girls to go into computers. As a matter of fact, I have she's a great niece, one of my nephew's daughters. Her next birthday, she's getting a small computer. It runs a Raspberry Pi processor, and it's got instructions on how to write code. She's 9 years old. I figure it's a good time to get her interested in this.
From what I've read, she's just before the age where social pressure really hits girls and discourages them from being as pursuing mathematics and technology. It's from what I've read, it's the social pressure around junior high has really put a damper on women going into technological fields.
Yeah, it's all social bias. It has nothing to do with innate ability. It's all social bias. And all I can say is it's gotten better in the last 50 years. It's not good enough, but it has gotten better. And what we need is people to get in there, you know, young women to put up with some of the bullshit, young men to stop dishing it out, and you know, fathers and brothers to encourage their sisters and daughters.
One last thing I need to pass the mic on. I remember around in the maybe 82 or 83 reading an ad for some software called The Last One, which was supposed to write programs for you. You just describe your data structure and what you want to pull out of it, and it was going to do it all for you. And still waiting to see something that comes anywhere close to that.
Well, you know, AI has a possibility of moving you in that direction. When I talk about writing programs and, you know, having to count lines that you've printed, people look at me sort of bizarrely. But there's this function that's available for people who are writing screen-based programs called Flexbox. And basically, it does this exactly the same thing. It's a different technology, but when you've got little screens and big screens and in between screens and you want to put some boxes on it, it matters the order in which you put them. And so somebody has come up with this thing called Flexbox that you can give it the rules, and it will figure out the best way to lay out those boxes based on the size of the screen. And it's, you know, it's just fascinating, but it's, again, we're just moving further and further away from what the actual hardware does. So I think I think programming is a dying occupation, perhaps.
One little thing that I think is important, when you mentioned the one woman that had a child and the rest of you all giving up your the idea of family to have longer careers. In this country, which is so wealthy and has so much to offer, I do think it's very disappointing that for men and women, the maternity and paternity leave is very poor compared to other developed countries. So if we could agitate for anything, I'd love to see that happen, because that to me is true family values, the ability to have a career, both men and women, and still enjoy raising your family. So I thought that was a really important point, and I think it's a really big issue in this country. I'd love to see people activate to get that better for both sexes.
For what it's worth, I have a sister-in-law who's 16 years younger than I am, and she is a senior aeronautical engineer at Boeing. And somehow things have changed, perhaps because my brother helped out, but they raised two daughters, and she had this fantastic career. So it can be done, but you're right, we need to do more, definitely need to do more in the way of parental leave when children are born.
So I have two comments in response to previous questions, and then I have a question for you also. So one thing I've noticed, like regarding this trend, is that I seem to see, like at conferences and other places, I see a really big uptick in women coming into computer science. It's in data science and artificial intelligence. I don't know if anybody else has picked up on that, but that's a very interesting kind of trend.
My question is, how do you define women in computers? Is data science computers, or is it not? You know.
I mean, I don't know. Personally, I find it pretty hard to argue that data science is not part of computers, but the other, what was okay, I don't quite remember the other comment I was going to make. So, but I guess the question is, how do you see the impacts, like how do you see the workplace culture changing through the years? Like, do you think that possibly like, the workplace culture in computers has become more toxic to women somehow? Like, I know we've never had, oh, that's right, we've never quite had good like support for, say, maternity leave and things like that. But I don't know, in other respects, where do you see this going? Well, like, and what do you think we can do as an industry to change and make things more, better?
The biggest form of discrimination that I faced during my career was a lack of mentors. There weren't a lot of women who were willing to be mentors because they were too busy building their own career. You make the same comment to me. And there were not a lot of men who were willing to run the risk of being seen hanging out with a young woman. So the one time I did have a mentor, my career was sort of progressing along, and all of a sudden it went rocketing off in a different direction. And the impression that I get, and this is just an impression because when I retired in 2001, I walked away from computers. So I can't talk to what's happened in the last 17 years. But the impression that I got is that mentors are becoming easier for women to get. And so I don't think that there's necessarily, the workplace is any more toxic towards women. Again, and I think that it's just the things that are missing, like being a mentor, being listened to. I hate to keep bringing that up, but it's a real problem. Men do not listen to women. On the other hand, if you have a group of women and a man walks in, you get the same thing in reverse. So there's probably something else going on there. But I've gotten very pushy over the years. I was at a political event last summer before the primary, and I went over to ask the candidate a question. She was talking to someone, and I was sort of standing there waiting my turn, and just as she was finishing up, a 20-year younger than me man came over, and she turned to him to see what his question was. This happens. And being me, I just sort of was rude and interrupted and asked my question. But men need to be aware of the fact that everybody, including women, have a tendency, because it was a woman candidate, have a tendency to listen to men before they listen to women. And it's a cultural thing, and we need to figure out how to break it. And until we do, women just have to be pushier.
Being the basic sciences, I guess I have a basic question. Has there been a change in the number of women or percentage of women who design computers?
Hardware. You're talking hardware now?
Yes.
I don't know. I was always a software person, and I really don't know what the hardware side of things looks like. So can't answer that one.
So a comment on the men and women in the workplace, having worked in a lot of computer industry settings and in Silicon Valley, and one observation maybe is along the lines of Deborah Tannen's book, You Just Don't Understand, and her thesis was men tend to approach relationships hierarchically, and women tend to approach more relatedly and wish to relate. So, and I would see it over and over again in business where the men would enter an interaction and try and establish who's on top and who's taking the second place, and not really give a lot of thought to the feelings of the other person and how that would make the relationship. And then whatever was established, somebody won, somebody maybe lost, but there didn't seem to be that much hard feelings, and they come back and do it again the next day. Whereas the woman is looking to relate And in that interaction where perhaps needs to show some dominance, might be more reluctant to dominate for concern out of how the other person would feel. And so that difference in interaction, and then if you're tilting with the numbers with more men who are going for more dominance, and then the women are not trying to press the dominance, I think that's what can make the environment seem unfriendly to women. And I'm not sure that I really have a solution, except maybe that, you know, women need to press their dominance more, as you say, be more pushy. And men need to understand perhaps that the women may have something to offer, but they're not coming over the top in a dominating way to get their idea across.
I think we're taught this as children. Boys are taught to be competitive. Girls are taught to get along. It's not surprising that it carries on in later life. I'd like to just sort of make a comment about the women being concerned about feelings and the men being concerned about facts. I'm one of 6 children, and as it turned out, 4 of us were thinkers, organized things by the fact. 2 of us were feelers. The 2 that were feelers were boys. So you know, feeling is not necessarily a female trait. Logical thinking is not necessarily a male trait. This business of genderized things, I think, hurts men as much as it hurts women. Many men go into fields that they really don't want to because that's what they're supposed to do. It cuts both ways.
Yeah, raising a daughter, I found that athletics and sports were what kept her in the sciences.
Makes sense?
Yeah. She gained a lot of confidence, and she was kind of distanced from the regular cultural pressures like weight and what you look like, because she was more busy about getting down the hill faster.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation.
So I started in 83, 84. And one of the things, I wasn't a math science person. I ended up in computer science and had a very successful career. One of the things that my dad did for me, though, is that he taught me to stand up for myself and not let the guys dominate me, to stand my ground. And he didn't care what career I went into. He didn't push me towards computer science or the sciences at all, because he didn't know anything about that. But that's the skill he gave me that really served me well as an early computer scientist, was not to let the guys talk over me, right? I mean, it'd be nice if it didn't happen, but it does. And so you can either say, well, I wish the whole thing, you know, that this whole culture of my group would change, which isn't, it'd be nice if that happened, but it's not going to. You have to stand up for yourself. So maybe that's something that fathers and mothers can teach their girls, is that to stand up for yourself and not let boys, men dominate. And I think then you can choose whatever career you want, but that's an important aspect.
Yes, I must have.
That'd be great too.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I get really irritated when I hear young women talking about how rough it is. It's like, it used to be rougher. Grow up. But the fact is, it is what it is, and as you say, the best skill you can teach somebody is to not be a wallflower, to stand up and say the things that you think need to be said.
One last question.
Thank you for all that you've done, because as a woman in STEM right now, I really appreciate what you've done before us to help us out. To comments about standing up for yourself, I always have, and I am so grateful that I have the guts to do it. It makes a huge difference. But I'd like to know what advice you'd give a woman developing her career in STEM, and if it would differ from the advice you give a man.
It would be exactly the same advice. Find something that you like doing and do it. You know, I mean, if you're really interested, programming's a lot of fun. And if you like doing it, make a career of it. You know, if you like flower arranging, make a career out of that. I mean, I think the most important thing for getting the most out of everybody in our society is to have people do the things that they like. So I would give the same advice to a young girl as I would to be a young boy, is find something you like, set your mind on it, and ignore the things that get in your way. Because I have a nephew who wants to be a chef. He's probably being sidetracked into politics, because it's more of a male thing to do still. But he'd be a wonderful chef, and I wish he wouldn't get sidetracked. So.
All right, thank you for your presentation. That was fantastic. And thank you everyone for attending. We appreciate you coming. You are the reason that we're here. I'm really excited that Mary was finally able to make it. We've been working on getting Mary to come speak now for over 2 years, so it was great to finally make it happen. Before you take off, please stop in at Dave's booth for Heads Up Health and check it out and see what he has on offer there. And hopefully we'll see everyone next month. Have a good night.